is the culmination of several months of work tied to Mission Capital's strategic direction of equipping and connecting mission-driven leaders, organizations, and networks as we advance equity and opportunity in Central Texas. Over a year ago, Mission Capital joined our national partner, the Building Movement Project, as they were conducting regional and statewide data assessments on the racial leadership gaps in the nonprofit sector across the country. They chose Austin, along with other cities, to conduct a deeper analysis of the racial leadership gap in our nonprofit sector. We're honored to bring this conversation to Central Texas to debunk myths and support the work to dismantle systemic barriers for leaders of color in our nonprofit sector. We're really excited to hear from our BMP colleagues and local nonprofit leaders on a panel today. And we'd also like to recognize the sponsorship and partnership of many other organizations who made this work possible. So I'd like to thank, special thanks to Andy Roddick Foundation, Austin Community Foundation, Blackbaud, Impact Austin, JP Morgan Chase, Leadership Austin, One Voice Central Texas, St. David's Foundation, United Way for Greater Austin, the RGK Center, the City of Austin's Equity Office, the Mayor's Office, Measure, and the New Philanthropists. And just a little bit of context to recap, in the fall of 2019, the Building Movement Project partnered with Mission Capital to survey our local nonprofit sector, and we had over 350 respondents. In January of 2020, BMP came to Austin and conducted 4 focus groups, and we convened a discussion on how our community might activate this data to close the racial leadership gap. And here we are today in, for many of us, what is now week 9 of shelter in place, navigating a COVID-19 environment. And it's an environment where the stakes are even higher than before for communities of color, underscoring that it's time to think about these issues systematically and structurally. And so today we'll hear from Ofronoma Biu, our lead researcher from BMP, sharing an overview of our Central Texas data findings. Ofronoma's presentation will be followed by a panel of leaders of color representing their nonprofit organizations. They'll be sharing their leadership wisdom and how we can collectively build the leadership pipeline in our community. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ofronoma.
Okay, thank you again for joining today. Again, I'm Ofronoma Biu, Senior Research Associate with the Building Movement Project. So I do want to mention that we have some social media if you want to join us. Our handle is @BuildingMovement, and our hashtag is #RaceToLead. So first, I'll tell you about the Building Movement Project. It is a national research organization that's designed to develop resources and tools to help the nonprofit sector engage in more progressive social change. We work in 3 areas, moving from right to left, movement building, so that's acknowledging and building on the distinct role that nonprofits have in advancing movements for social change. Second, in the middle, is service and social change. That's developing the capacity of organizations, especially nonprofit human service organizations, to engage constituents in addressing the root causes of the issues that are impacting them. And finally, we have leadership, and analyzing how organizations can do their best work by having inclusive and effective practices. And that is where the Race to Lead work falls. So back in 2016, the Building Movement Project launched its first survey of nonprofit staff around the country. Over 4,000 people responded then. And that first Race to Lead survey was designed to answer the question why there are so few leaders of color in the nonprofit sector, despite the leadership programs that have been developed to train people of color to compete for jobs. However, what the survey results revealed is that the focus on people of color who are already as qualified as their white counterparts avoided addressing the people and structures that stand in the way of access and opportunity. Since 2016, we know there's been an explosion of interest in race and race equity in the sector. The presidential election was held after the survey went out. So conducting the survey again in 2019 made a lot of sense, and it provided us with an opportunity to learn more about changes in the sector and collect some new information. So using the survey, we are going to release another national report, which will be out in the coming weeks. And we're also working to release reports in partnership with certain regional areas, including, of course, Central Texas, but also Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Boston, Massachusetts. The Central Texas report is the first one in the series, and we will be sharing the report with the participants after. So we have two main sources of data for this report, and I do want to give special thanks to Mission Capital and their partners who helped us get 350 people from the Central Texas area to respond to our new 2019 survey. That's out of the 5,200 people nationwide. The findings also come from focus groups held in December 2019 in Austin, Texas, and organized around 4 demographic categories. There were Millennial and Gen Z people of color, Millennial and Gen Z white people, Gen X and baby boomers of color, and Gen X and baby boomer white people. A subset of participants for the Gen X and baby boomer sessions also stayed for a special focus group for executive directors and CEOs. So I'll tell you about who took the survey. The Central Texas sample had a slightly larger share of respondents who are white than nationally. So as you can see on the bottom, 63% of the respondents in Central Texas were white compared to 58% nationally. 37% of the Central Texas respondents were people of color compared to 42% nationally. The Central Texas sample had a larger share of Latinx or Hispanic respondents. There were 18% of the sample in Central Texas compared to 10% nationally. The Central Texas sample also had fewer Black respondents, 4% of the sample compared to 14% nationally. In terms of gender identity, the majority of respondents, both nationally and in Central Texas, are women. And the Central Texas sample had a somewhat larger share of women and fewer men and gender non-binary, non-conforming, or genderqueer respondents. In terms of race and gender, compared to the national sample, there were similar shares of women of color filling out the survey. 32% in Central Texas and 33% nationally. There are more white women responding to the survey in Central Texas, 54% compared to 48% nationally. Somewhat fewer men of color and white gender non-conforming and non-binary genderqueer responded. In terms of generation, there were a larger share of millennials and Gen Z respondents to the survey from Central Texas, 53% compared to 47% nationally. Also more Gen X, 38% compared to 34% nationally, and a much smaller share of the baby boomers and older leaders, 10% compared to 19% nationally. And the vast majority of survey participants in the Central Texas sample and nationally had at least a bachelor's degree, over 90% in both Central Texas for people of color and white respondents, so equally qualified. So likely due to the larger proportion of younger participants in Central Texas, we did see that overall Central Texas respondents have spent fewer years working in the sector, on average 11 years compared to 13 nationally, but at the same time at the job they were in at the time of the survey, which was 4 years on average. And in terms of roles, which is shown on the slide, the most common type of role held by respondents nationally and in Central Texas was a senior manager or director. About a third of respondents. There are fewer executive directors or CEOs in Central Texas responding to the survey than nationally, and also more middle managers and more line and admin staff. We did also notice that just a quarter of the CEOs responding to the survey were people of color compared to 31% in the overall national sample. So to highlight some of the findings from this report, they'll cover these 4 items. First is leadership aspirations among people of color and white respondents in Central Texas and how this compares to the national sample. How leadership networks in the area impact careers, who leads, and funding prospects. The challenges faced by staff, including economic well-being and organizational dynamics. And then finally, the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So first, aspirations to lead. So a key finding in the National Race to Lead report series is that respondents of color were more interested in pursuing nonprofit leadership positions than their white counterparts. And a similar pattern can be found in Central Texas, where half of the respondents of color aspired to be executive director. They weren't one already. That's compared to 39% of the white respondents. So we do think it's important to note the leadership aspirations of people of color and how the sector can then be more supportive. So now let's turn to the findings around networks. Survey respondents were asked about their access to mentors and role models and the importance of social capital and networks in the sector. We found that people of color in Central Texas were less likely than white respondents to say they had mentors outside of their workplaces. And they're also less likely than white respondents to say they had access to mentors inside their workplaces. This was similar to the national sample. People of color were more likely to say that they often or always lacked role models, which you can see on the left. 44% of people of color in Central Texas said they lacked role models compared to 22% of white respondents. And these figures are pretty similar to the national sample. So while people of color in Central Texas were less likely to have had mentors and role models than their white counterparts, they were more likely to say they had received peer support. We know peer support can be helpful for people of color to navigate the workplace. For example, in our survey, we looked at the write-in responses. We saw that people of color facing discrimination in the workplace often turn to peers for support. However, we know that peer support won't translate to career opportunities if people don't have access to the gatekeepers in the local nonprofit sector. So as you can see on the right, a third of people of color in the Central Texas sample said they often or always lacked access to social capital or networks, compared to just 14% of white respondents. And for people of color, this was somewhat higher in the Central Texas sample than nationally by 4 percentage points. Survey respondents were able to provide write-in responses, and they talked about their lack of access to networks. So here's a quote from a woman of color survey respondent who said that her identity has removed her from networking and relationship opportunities that could have assisted in her advancement. She's focused on building up her own champions to introduce her to new networks. Survey respondents were asked if they believe the lack of networks hinders the career advancement for people of color. You can see that 65% of people of color in Central Texas agreed with that statement, and 69% of people of color nationally. Significantly fewer white respondents agree with the statement that it's harder for people of color to advance because of smaller networks, 42% nationally and even less, 36% in Central Texas. In focus groups with people of color in Austin, we shared that data, and several participants really distinguished between the size and power of networks, and overall, overwhelmingly, people of color focus group respondents, especially the Gen X and baby boomers, said that it's not really about how many people you know that determines nonprofit career success, but who you know. And they emphasize that people of color do have networks that are equal in size to their white counterparts, but the connections are not as valued by those in power. And they might not be the quote unquote right ones to get ahead. Also, focus group participants said that networks between white nonprofit leaders in Central Texas don't often extend to people of color unless they have a direct connection to specific universities like University of Texas at Austin or Texas A&M University. And here's a quote from a person of color Gen X focus group participant who said, "I don't believe it's people of color have smaller professional networks. It's that our professional networks don't have the same power and access that white, middle class, normative, cisgender networks have." So let's get into how networks can translate into outcomes. The survey asked people specifically about the impact of various identities on their careers, including race. So did the impact of race have a positive, neutral, or negative outcome? And only 23% of Central Texas people of color said race had a positive impact on their career advancement compared to 32% nationally. 53% of people of color in Central Texas said their race had negatively impacted their career advancement, while 49% said so nationally. And less than 5% of white people in Central Texas and nationally said race had a negative impact. Survey respondents had an opportunity to write in and talk about how race had impacted their careers, and people of color described the challenge of knowing they had advanced qualifications and years of experience, but being denied jobs and opportunities in favor of less experienced white applicants. So here's a quote from a Central Texas survey participant who pointed out that Texas is an interesting state with a racialized history. She talks about hitting the glass ceiling several times, despite having levels of education, unique fellowship experience, and years of work experience, seeing less experienced white women or male leaders of color ascended to promotion. And the focus group participants had some similar sentiments. So for example, there's one participant who tried to apply for executive director positions, was told they didn't want to take a risk on a person of color who'd never been an executive director before. But then this person sees white nonprofit leaders in CEO positions who'd never had executive experience. And when we look at who leads organizations in Central Texas and of course nationally, we do see that the composition of organizations tends to be whiter at the top in terms of both board and leadership. We do see more people of color towards the bottom in terms of non-senior staff roles and among the community served. In Central Texas, the majority of respondents, 56%, work for organizations where at least 3/4 of both the board and senior staff was white. The share that's higher in Central Texas than in the national sample, 45%. And just 3% of respondents in Central Texas, all of whom were people of color, work for organizations where more than half of the board and senior staff were people of color. Another important aspect of networks and relationships has to do with fundraising. So in Central Texas, people of color were twice as likely to report that they often or always lacked relationships with funding sources. And we did note that the gap between people of color and white respondents on this particular question was much larger in Central Texas than nationally, a gap of 21 percentage points compared to 10 percentage points nationally. In focus groups, both white people and people of color in executive director roles described local fundraising challenges and reviewed survey results about national fundraising, including the differences in responses that I just showed you between white people and people of color. So members of the white focus group noted that Austin has many nonprofits but few foundations, and more than one white CEO characterized the region as lacking a strong philanthropic tradition. Overall, members of the white CEO focus group thought factors other than race were more significant in shaping challenges that executive directors might have. Although fundraising can be challenging for all, the Central Texas CEOs of color described distinct racial disparities in their experiences. So they characterized foundations and government agencies as favoring larger organizations, even for equity-specific grants, which is a strategy that effectively disadvantages people of color who are more likely to lead smaller organizations. Many leaders of color described receiving smaller grants than larger white-led peer organizations doing similar work. To call attention to some of the inequities in local funding, one focus group participant described making ongoing gradual efforts to educate funders about equity and inclusion. Another shared that in a prior organization that person was had a relationship with, they began asking prospective funders about their own equity strategies, about how many people of color and women were on their own leadership teams, and ultimately walking away if it wasn't a good fit. But many organizations and leaders of color did not feel they could decline funding or speak candidly to funders about diversity and race. So here's another quote from a CEO focus group participant who said that they didn't want their little organization to get nothing, so they're going to be grateful for that small grant. But then wondering if they're perpetuating some sort of negative feedback cycle. So now let's transition to some other challenges that CEOs and staff experienced that emerged from the survey and focus groups, including economic well-being and organizational dynamics. Survey participants were asked about their salaries, and we did see that people of color in Central Texas were more likely than white counterparts to report that their income was in the lower brackets that we developed, under 50,000, and less likely to fall in the higher brackets of 95,000 or more. There were even larger differences between people of color and white respondents when it came to raises. So on the left, 34% of people of color in Central Texas received a cost of living salary increase compared to 49% of white respondents. People of color in Central Texas were also less likely to exceed a performance-based raise. As you can see on the right, 31% for people of color in Central Texas compared to 43% of white respondents. This was somewhat lower for people of color in Central Texas than nationally. Other survey findings illustrate some of the economic challenges that people of color described working in the nonprofit sector in Central Texas. So shown on the left, people of color were more likely to say that they were not being paid a salary that was high enough for their needs. 51% of people of color said this was often or always a concern, compared to 43% of white respondents. Compared to white respondents, people of color were also more likely to say that they often or always contend with being paid less than peers for the same work, as you can see on the right. 28% of people of color compared to 22% of white respondents. And aside from these disparities, people of color also deal with other financial concerns. So in the survey, people of color in Central Texas were more than twice as likely to say that they currently support family members outside of the household. They're also less likely to rely on another source of income to cover household expenses. Here's a quote from a survey participant who talks about the lack of financial support, saying that the organization they work for raises dollars off the communities, requires them to be a voice, but hasn't financially empowered them to do the work. The 2019 Race to Lead survey also asked about organizational dynamics, which was one of our newer sets of questions. So the survey presented a series of statements about the nonprofit workplace, and people ranked on a scale of 1, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. So some of the topics I'm sharing have to do with 1, I would be happy working in the organization 3 years from now. 2, I feel I have a voice in the organization. And 3, my organization offers fair and equitable opportunities for advancement. And overall, white respondents had higher average ratings on all of these. White survey takers in Central Texas were somewhat more favorable than people of color on being happy to work at their organization 3 years, an average of 7.2 for white respondents and 6.8 for people of color. The rate of agreement was slightly lower for white people in Central Texas, the national findings, and slightly higher for people of color in Central Texas than nationally. When it comes to having a voice, again, white respondents had a higher average rating of 7.5 compared to 6.9 for people of color. And here, both white and people of color had a slightly lower rating in Central Texas than in the national sample. And finally, white respondents had a higher score on their perception that there are fair and equitable opportunities for advancement in organizations, an average of 6.6 compared to 5.8 for people of color. And when we analyzed national survey responses, we found that being happy with the prospect of working in the same organization 3 years was positively associated with a number of different factors, including having a voice in the organization and perceiving fair and equitable opportunities for advancement. Focus group participants, especially people of color, echoed this association, and they connected their interest with staying in an organization longer with the degree to which they felt their voice was heard and the opportunity for promotion was open and fair. And they expressed frustration when these factors were absent. Several participants of color described frustrations with how board or senior leadership ignore concerns about racial bias in hiring and promotion, unless a white staff person brought it up. They also said that their organizations ignored and minimized concerns about racial diversity in staffing or how clients were treated. So here's a quote from a person of color in the Millennial Gen Z focus group who said that they put their voice out there and were vulnerable, but felt undervalued, disrespected, and not heard, and that made this person not want to stay in the organization. And some of the people of color in Gen X and baby boomer focus groups also expressed frustration about lacking power in their organizations, even though they tended to be in more middle and senior level positions. So our last finding has to do with DEI efforts in organizations. The nonprofits in the US are taking steps to being more diverse, equitable, inclusive, it seems, and this pattern is readily apparent in Central Texas. So we asked in the survey if people's organizations had some type of DEI initiative, and more than 2/3 of people in Central Texas said yes. The difference with the national results is that white people were more likely to say that was the case in their organizations, 73% compared to 64% of people of color. And then the survey, if people said, yes, my organization has a DEI initiative, we asked them to select from a list of strategies organizations were using. The most common one by far in Central Texas was training. That was for 70% of people overall. There were others, like clarifying that DEI is central to the organization's mission, addressing race equity and how it impacts the issues the organization works on, and also increasing representation on boards and advisory committees. We figured that training would be the big strategy, so we asked about the impact. And overall, in the survey, people did say that the impact of training was positive. There was a difference where 92% of white respondents said it was positive, compared to 86% of people of color. So some focus group participants talked about training being a good first step. For example, this quote here, first step to helping people be a bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable and opening doors. But overall, feedback in the focus groups tended to be more critical of training. People of color focus group participants described training as something organizations use to check off a box to say they're taking action on diversity. Other concerns that came up around training were that senior leaders didn't actually attend, or that curricula lacked depth, and had people of color participating in sessions that were really centered around white people. and also that white colleagues were required to participate but weren't really invested in learning. So here's a quote from a person of color, Gen X baby boomer, who talks about the limits of training as a strategy that really summed up a common theme, which is that trainings aren't going to eradicate racism, not in Austin and not everywhere. And the focus group participants talked about the effectiveness of DEI initiatives in general. One white focus group participant said that their organization is good at attracting people of color, but not good at retaining them. And another white participant said something similar, that the organization had been doing DEI work for several years, but hadn't been addressing internal practices, so people of color were leaving. Throughout the focus groups, one of the primary factors that made people of color express hesitation or unhappiness about staying in their organizations in the coming years had to do with dissatisfaction around the DEI efforts that were happening. Overall, focus groups participants wanted to see more commitment from leaders to making real change. And the survey did ask the respondents if the leadership consisted commitment, had to demonstrate commitment to being equitable, inclusive, and diverse. And survey respondents in Central Texas ranked that commitment 6.7 on average, with white respondents giving leaders a higher score of 7.1 to people of color. And focus group participants really echoed this. So for example, here's a quote from a white respondent who said that their leader says, "We're fine, we're doing good." And that person's pointing out it's easy for them to say, the white leader, but the people of color on their team don't think it's fine. And they're pointing out that there's just a lot of resistance to change across the board. And that was something executive directors of color even experienced with their own supervisors, the board of directors, who were resistant in some cases to talking about diversity in board composition and around the mission of the organization. So I'll leave with this last quote from a person of color, Gen X baby boomer focus group participant, who talks about operationalizing equity and inclusion like going to the gym, defining it so that it's not open to interpretation, and being accountable to look at the results, see where changes are happening, and move forward. So that's the overall findings from the report. We do see lots of opportunities for organizations, for leadership to take a stand, to address the experiences of people of color, create policies to ensure equity, and address racism and other forms of discrimination where it may occur. And for making sure that leadership, including boards, reflects the community served, and creating benchmarks and continuously measuring results as shared in that last quote. And for the sector, we do see that funders financially supporting and scaling up people of color-led organizations would be an important initiative, as well as funders and nonprofits working in partnership with each other to engage in systems change work. Especially now more than ever, we really think boldness is the way to move forward. So I'll end my presentation there.
Thanks so much, Ofronoma. That's all right. So we're going to move into Q&A section, and we've already gotten a couple of questions. So some participants are curious about why more white folks versus POC identified in taking the survey, and the same with specifically white women versus female POC, if you've seen any trends locally or nationally as you conduct this data research.
So I think it has to do with the fact that they're a larger share of the population overall. So for example, in terms of the composition of people of color, white respondents in some areas, we looked at census data, it made sense. So I think that's why the proportions were shaping up that way.
Great. And then another question we received is the mentor considered to be a person of color / same background as respondent, or have you seen the definition to be a mentor of any background?
We didn't ask what the mentor looked like. I can share from our past research from the Women of Color report. A lot of the women of color had received mentoring from women of color and wanted that, but also had received some good mentoring from other people, including white men, white women, men of color. And we're just looking for that support, someone to speak up for them and help them find opportunities and give them advice. So I don't think it's necessarily that it has to be another person of color. I think it is obviously helpful because they can relate to their experiences, but I think the key thing is that the mentoring isn't available in the same way for people of color.
And then relatively younger respondents in Central Texas compared nationally may also be expressed in a smaller percentage of CEO positions. How do the demographics compare to Central Texas overall?
How do the demographics compare to Central Texas overall? So I did share that there were, I would say compared to our first survey, there were more younger respondents this time around than 2016, and that's nationally. In Central Texas, there were a higher proportion of younger respondents, more millennials and Gen Z, and also more Gen X and baby boomers of color. So I hope that answers the question. I think they're perhaps linking it to why there are fewer executive directors. That could possibly be a linkage. Sure.
Okay, and then any surprises in terms of how Austin rates compared to national data?
I didn't really know what to expect necessarily. I'm located in New York City, so it was my first encounter with Central Texas. I think one thing that stood out that was a bit surprising was the gap in the relationship with funding sources being much bigger in Central Texas than nationally. But then it did make sense given some of the concerns that were expressed in the focus groups.
Is there research on the efficacy of nonprofits with staff that is more demographically representative of their clients compared to those that don't look like their clients?
We've been talking about that a lot with our national report coming out. I know that there is some research around that in the education sector. There is some research in the nonprofit sector on board leadership, having more people of color, some more effective practices there. We are seeing in our own research, and again, you'll see this more in the national report, that when organizations have more leaders of color in board and leadership, we found that some of those organizational dynamic questions were more positive for everyone, not just people of color, but also white respondents. So things like the organization having fair and equitable opportunities for advancement, people feeling like they would be happy to work there in 3 years, people feeling like they have a voice in the organization. Those were higher in organizations that had higher shares of both people of color in leadership and in the board.
Got it. How does Austin compare to other urban city centers where you have conducted this research?
I would say, so this is the first report in the series, and we'll be releasing our next ones in the coming months. I will say, just from looking at the focus groups, a lot of the concerns that came up around organizational dynamics were pretty similar. I would say that was certainly a trend. I would say overall, the experiences of people of color when it comes to networks and relationships with funders, we don't see that it's necessarily any better. Unfortunately, not even in majority people of color cities, because again, who holds power tends to be the white leaders in all areas.
And I think we'll probably have room for about one more question, and it's that, have you come across funders who are interested in this information? Yes,
absolutely. There certainly are funders who are interested in this information, and some foundations did support in certain areas our ability to put these reports out and to partner in certain regional areas to produce it. So absolutely, there are funders who are interested in the information.
Great. So that concludes our Q&A section. Thanks so much, Ofronoma, for all of your presentation and your information and for answering these questions. And now we'll get to hear from our panelists. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our CEO, Madge.
Thank you. Thank you, Ofronoma. Thank you all for your questions and your insights. We'll now shift into our panel presentation, where we've invited our panelists to share their observations on the Central Texas data. And so I'm honored to welcome our guests, our panelists today. We've got Cristina Collazo, founder and executive director of Todos Juntos Learning Center, Rachel Coy, director of health and nutrition for Feeding Texas, and Carl Nichols, vice president of investor development for E3 Alliance. So welcome, everyone. And to kick us off, I am going to invite each panelist to reflect on the gaps that Ofronoma just outlined for us, and respond to your perspective on the single most important thing the nonprofit sector in Central Texas needs to consider as we build a more inclusive leadership pipeline. And so the question is, reflecting on the gap that Ofronoma just outlined in terms of our Central Texas data, what is the single most important thing our nonprofit sector can do to build a more inclusive leadership pipeline? And so Carl, I'll kick it to you to open up and then we'll go around.
Good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is. Feels like Groundhog Day sometimes since we've all been on quarantine. Again, my name is Carl Nichols. I'm Vice President of Investor Development at E3 Alliance. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for this important, relevant data that you've shared. I think for me, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I don't know if I have one single answer, but I would call it in the area of policy, practice, and process. I think one single thing around policy was that we need to, as a nonprofit sector, adopt what we call, similar to what the NFL did, called the Rooney Rule, where they actually required the NFL required that they had a policy around making sure that when they hired new coaches or general managers, that they always considered minorities or populations that were normally not being represented in that well. Why can't we do that for Central Texas? You know, what would it take for us to adopt something like that? For something around practice, I think we need to be more intentional about mentoring and networking and what that looks like, particularly for senior level managers and leaders, because it seems like there's a huge gap between the transition of when you are kind of pivoting towards an opportunity to be a CEO and then something is not happening, to make sure that handoff happens. And so how can we make sure that people that are in those roles and those positions that maybe not necessarily are people of color can making sure that they're passing the baton and the torch to the next generation of leaders? And then I think we need to have process around access and accountability. Do we really practice? People respect what you inspect. And so I think we need to have more accountability about how we actually are measuring this on a regular basis in terms of, are we actually achieving certain standards or certain goals around this? You know, for example, you know, when I became a fundraiser for E3 Alliance, I got access to funding and funders that I didn't have access to prior to that because of my CEO and her relationships with philanthropy and those connections. And so because of my ability to have those connections with high-level foundations, high-level donors, I was able to join a board and actually double the budget size of that organization because I had access to those funders. And so practice and policy and access is important to see this turn around.
Thanks, Carl. Christina?
Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Colazzo. I'm the founder and executive director of Build a Twinkles Learning Center. First, I just want to say I'm really glad that these conversations are taking place. Thank you, Mission Capital, for allowing us to be here today and talk about this. I just ask that we not stop here, that we keep these conversations going. I think that there are a lot of things that are important to keep in mind, whether you're a funder, a peer, a leader of another organization. I think first that we need greater investment of time and money into leadership development and support for these leaders. I also think that we need a greater emphasis on the need and the importance of social capital, especially for organizations led by people of color. As the leader of Build a Twinkles, I truly believe that social capital has been the most critical factor to my progress as a leader and that of the organization. And also, during the presentation, I was listening about peer support, and that has been invaluable to us as an organization. It really has been the one thing that has been consistent that I can turn to if I need to lean on someone. Peer support has been incredibly valuable to me. I think also to keep in mind that it's always challenging to run a nonprofit, but please remember that whatever you have identified as the challenges of this work, the lived reality of a person of color in my position is likely many times harder than that. And I'm also going to just go out there and make myself a little vulnerable, but even being asked to be a participant on this panel today, I was once again faced with fear and uncertainty that maybe I didn't deserve to be here, or maybe I didn't have anything relevant to add. And I'm always trying to challenge myself to do better work or to serve our families. But without role models or leaders who look like me, I often internalize the systemic barriers that I face, and sometimes I blame myself. And sometimes I don't even realize when I've faced an inequity. sometimes it takes me stepping back and reflecting before I realize that what a well-meaning person said or did or insinuated really wasn't okay at all. But then it doesn't stop there, because then I have to stop again and think about how I respond, what I say, and how I say it, because I could potentially be making myself vulnerable or my organization vulnerable more than we already are, and possibly jeopardize the relationships that we really rely on to thrive in our community. And I think also just that the pool and the power dynamics are not balanced. As a person of color, I have to wade through a lot of levels of thought that I don't think my white counterparts have to.
Thank you, Christina. Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I work at Feeding Texas as the Director of Health and Nutrition, and I identify as a Chinese American woman. And I think the data point that sticks out most to me is similar, is that people who look like me and people of color are equally experienced and can do the work of leading nonprofits. But we experience additional barriers. And so for myself, I think being very personal, being a child of immigrants, my mom and dad didn't know many people who were managers or who worked in the nonprofit sector. And so there was never a, hey, can you talk to my daughter about this interest? I didn't have that social capital versus now as I work, I often get asked like, hey, can you talk to my daughter about A, B, or C? And that is just, I think a difference of opportunity to pick a brain of someone you want to be like. And so I think for those of us who are people of color, like we need to continue mentoring, and for people who identify as white, I think just understanding that there aren't these natural pipelines already of connecting the people you want to hire with the opportunity. And so even at Feeding Texas, as we think about how do we staff our organization to have more people with lived experiences, or at least look similar and understand the culture of people who participate in our programs, it's going to take a different approach to finding those people. It's not, it's our responsibility to broaden like the pipelines we have and to build those relationships to find the people with the experience and perspective that we need to have strong programs and strong strategies.
Thank you, Rachel. So next question. What have you all observed in our Central Texas community in the response to COVID-19 as it relates to racial disparities? How is COVID-19 exacerbating racial disparities in Central Texas through the lens of your work?
I can go first.
Go for it.
So in the world of food insecurity, I'm sure many of y'all have seen the articles of the long lines of people accessing food at food distributions. So at Feeding Texas, we take more of a state perspective. So if you allow me to kind of broaden beyond Central Texas, we've seen a spike, like a 60% spike in people lining up. And of those who line up, about 40% of them are completely new to participating in these services. Although kind of data that we're collecting is still churning, so we're not quite sure, but we suspect and we know that hunger disproportionately affects people of color, in particular brown and Black communities. And so knowing that, and also knowing, for example, Black communities are have higher rates of heart disease, are more susceptible to a lot of different things that kind of augment the effects of COVID, also are more likely to work in jobs that have a higher exposure rate to COVID. Those we know that, therefore we know we are expecting that not only one, in order to respond to COVID, we need to be very sensitive and intentional about how we're selecting sites and partners that give us more access to Black and Brown communities, but to also think more about, okay, what can we do? How do we build our network to continue responding to pre-COVID disparities that will continue as they're augmented by COVID. And so that's what we're seeing.
Thank you, Rachel. Christina.
Yeah, so for us, I mean, I think that the families that we serve, they tend to be more isolated than others for a number of reasons: language and cultural barriers, distrust of institutions, and just plain racism. The pandemic has isolated them even further, and it's created a whole other set of challenges that we're working through just to make sure that they're safe, that they're healthy, that they have dinner on the table, that they can meet their basic needs. And it's also really highlighted a lot of the inequities that I think we already all know have existed, but now it's just harder for the greater community to blatantly look away. A lot of the people that we support, they're really proud, they're really independent people. They came here because they love the American dream and what that stands for. But even with the challenges of the pandemic, they may still be far better off than some of their families who they've left behind back home. And sometimes taking money or assistance might be difficult for them. And also, just so many people have been incredibly generous to us as an organization, offering partnerships and financial support through this, and we are truly appreciative of that. In addition to that, though, what I would ask is that our friends have a stronger curiosity and desire to really understand the communities that we work with and the strengths and the assets within these communities, such as wisdom, experience, resilience, and perseverance.
Thank you, Christina. Carl.
And I would just kind of echo my colleagues. I think what all this has shown or revealed exactly historical and systematic structural inequalities that have already existed have just been magnified because of COVID-19. I mean, we look historically for African Americans in Austin. It happened in 1920 when there was huge segregation and relocation of a whole community that was authored and orchestrated by the city of Austin. Well, how do you take that to the modern day? You know, how does gentrification impact that? And then when you look at a public health system that has basically been flawed, right? So if African Americans already don't have access to good doctors, access to insurance, more are in domesticated jobs, they're going to be more exposed to the virus. And then you have a history of discrimination. It exacerbates in the education system, which I work in and try to raise money for. So school systems are seeing, there already existed a digital divide already with populations of color. It's been exacerbated because many people don't have access to computers or internet, so they've had to be creative, school districts, around how to create hotspots or to equal the field. And now we're learning that a lot of autonomous learning has not been happening in the classroom, so now teachers are having to regroup and rethink about how they teach. We already know there were challenges around social emotional learning with our students, so that has to be addressed. There's gaps. So we already were behind because of historical inequities around education. Now students are even more behind because they have not had the instruction that they typically are getting in the classrooms around digital learning. And then to cap it all off, we have this great data that was just presented where we don't have people of color in leadership that could actually have been active and proactively helping with giving more sensitivity around these issues. Had they been on the boards, had they been leading these organizations, some of this stuff could have been addressed because they would have been in that role and that function. And now we're even further behind. So I think it just exacerbates what we already knew. And now we have to be that much more vigilant about making it happen as we come out of this.
Thanks, Carl. And that's a great segue to our final question, which is, what do we hope for in a post-COVID society? What might that look like? And so what is required of us now to create the conditions to usher in a more equitable future for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian leaders in Central Texas? And so whoever wants to volunteer to take that. Aspirational. Okay.
I'll start. So I guess my hope for post-COVID world society is that we come away from this with a greater sense of interdependence. If my family gets sick or if your family gets sick, it affects everyone. This virus doesn't care what language you speak. It doesn't care what you think about politics. We are all connected. And I hope that people think about and just really start to understand what systemic inequity and inequality means, and how different groups shoulder the burden of impacts such as this pandemic. And that supporting these communities and trying to correct these inequities is the only way for us to really recover and to move and forge ahead as we look ahead. And like everyone else, Todos Juntos is still looking and working to figure out what the future looks like for us as an organization, what the future looks like for our families, and what our role will be in that. But the one thing that we're certain about, and the one thing that we are truly committed to, is that our families will have a voice and a say in what the future of our organization and our service delivery looks like post-quarantine and even through quarantine. And I think that's really the most important part, is remembering to be conscious of that, making sure that we are inviting our clients, our families, our students, our community to be a part of that process as we create new procedures and processes to live through this pandemic and after it.
Thank you, Christina. Who's next, Carl?
Sure. I work for an organization called E3 Alliance, which stands for Education Equals Economics. And part of the case that we make is that there's an economic imperative that all students learn, right? So why does it take an economic imperative for other communities to embrace an important directive around all students learning? Because they want to make sure they can retire, they want to make sure the economy is safe and that they continue to have great jobs and have a great standard of life. Well, it's not until people realize the urgency of why you need to bring Latinx, African Americans, people of color to the table, that they realize that we need to structurally change this stuff because we don't have a future. And it's too bad that it took a COVID-19 to get us to get even more awoke about the realities of what we need to move to. So how does this translate into actual action? Well, we need to be intentional, and we need to be committed to making sure that we are really building a nonprofit sector that is equitable, inclusionary. At E3, we've adopted core values of equity. We tried to establish equity targets, where we actually have looked at our blueprint for education training and said, what are we being more intentional about to make sure that we actually are moving the needle around equity and inclusion on key indicators around school readiness or math preparation or around college completion. We've actually developed a rubric, an equity rubric, where we're actually measuring both internally and externally how we're doing at these levels around equitable inclusion. We need to hire some more EDs and CEOs. Let's stop talking and let's start walking, okay? Why is it that we have a percentage of people that work and live and we serve in this community, but we are not representative of the people that are actually working in these jobs? We need to fix that. That seems like that's a simple issue and thing that we can handle. And then I think we also just need to begin to expand the opportunity. We need to get more deliberate. Now that we have the data that backs up that all these things are happening and going on around lack of advancement, lack of pay raises, lack of access to resources, lack of being able to access funders, then we need to actually begin to hold people accountable to it and make sure that's something that we are deliberately doing and moving the sector forward. So I just can applaud some of the efforts that have been going on around the Beyond Diversity training. And I think we're building an awareness around how structural inequities are impacting our community. But now we need to turn and translate that into more viable action in terms of how we can come back next year this time and say, you know what, we actually saw an increase of people of color in leadership in the last year because of these efforts. I think that would be a great place to start.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Rachel.
I appreciate the fire, Carl. I hope I can harness it for my thoughts. I think, now we are all having to reinvent the way we do things and having to relearn and adjust. And so I think this is like the time to really think about how do these, differences in leadership and the choices that we make, like how do we make it better? We're already reinventing everything else anyway. And so I think my hope is just asking myself, like, how do I fight racism in my own thoughts and practices and in my family? Like, how do I raise my daughter? And then also how do I fight racism where I sit in my organization? So, for example, I'm hiring for a position now. So is the recruiting process that I have an opportunity to kind of change, be as inclusive as possible. I think to like for those of y'all who may be similar to our organization where we're only 25 people and so we don't have a designated HR person, we've decided to have a DEI committee, and you know, there's so much that we don't know and we have limited resources to do, but over the last year we've chosen an equity definition that resonates with what we want to be, who we hope what our hopes for the world are. Try to review our HR practices, to do what we can with the resources we have to broaden our reach, and then and really think about what is our theory of change for our organization. Are there ways that we can facilitate learning from each individual in our organization to fight racism within themselves? And then how can we begin to think about undoing the structures in our workplace that intentionally or often unintentionally benefit only certain types of people. And so one thing that we've realized we haven't done a great job of is tracking like who identifies as what their achievement looks like over the years, what the retention, what trainings we've provided everybody. Are these really equitable or not? And we feel like, again, going back to the issue, it's imperative to think about it like that, because if we have internal structures that aren't fair, then that impacts the work that we then create or push out, or even co-create within the community. Those are going to be there. So I'm just trying to figure out what are our blind spots and how can we be intentional about making those blind spots smaller.
Thank you, Rachel, Christina, and Carl, for sharing your leadership wisdom with us. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and so I'm going to transition us to the Q&A part. I encourage our audience to use the chat box for questions, and then all questions will be read aloud by my colleague, Min Ha. So ask.
Yes. All right. And there have been a lot of questions that have come through, so thank you to your passion and fire and all your thoughtfulness from the panelists. First question, what role do you see white women in leadership needing to play? I am listening, speaking up when I believe my voice is helpful, actively encouraging and coaching young people, including people of color, but it doesn't feel like enough.
Who wants to tackle that one? I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think great. That's awesome. Keep it up. Keep advocating, keep providing opportunities, creating pathways. But some of it is passing the torch, right? Like some of us got to wait for y'all to retire or wait for the next, cadre of leadership. And a lot of times we're not the ones who are being mentored for that next role or that next role of advancement. And so I think part of continue to do that is that we need to have a pipeline. There needs to be constant mentoring of the next up and coming leader or person that's coming aboard. And then we need to be intentional about making sure that there are slots available for people when they are ready to actually come into those roles and those positions. It is power, it is influence. And if there's been kind of like an old guard that has been used to kind of having those roles and those positions, sometimes it's not easily given up, or it's been kind of a status quo kind of thing. And so I think there needs to be an intentionality around being deliberate about that. And I think also even stretching back even before people are seasoned leaders, that there are young people that have aspirations of going in those roles. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do at E3 is be more deliberate about how do we bring more student voice into the work that we do, and how do we begin to groom them right out of college to have a pathway towards senior level leadership and being an executive director at some point. And so I think we have to talk both sides of our mouth, both what we do today and what we're doing for the future generation.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right on, Carl, that we need to have environments that are inviting. I often think this, if I knew then what I know now, I don't know if this would have been an appealing sector for me. I don't know that I would have ventured into this work. And I think we need to work. I mean, I don't think that it's just up to us, though. I don't think it's just up to people of color to create these environments. I think we need our white allies to help us do that. I think I know for me in particular, I know that those relationships that I built early on, I had to work extra hard and make sure that the allies I was fortunate enough to acquire really trusted me, and then built on that trust. And it had to be like, sometimes I feel like I am really exposed, and that I need to be extra exposed so that people can trust me. And it's only now that I've gotten older that I realized why I had to work that hard. I think when I was younger, I was just in this, trying to create these programs, trying to get this organization off the ground, that I was doing what I had to do. But now that I look back, it's like, whoa, I don't know that I would have had to go through all of that if I wasn't who I am. And I think you're right. I think creating now what we want to present to our future leaders is really important, because like I said, if I was a young person and I saw all of the inequities, and also we have the internet now. When I was younger, we didn't have all this information being fed to us all the time. I think if I'd been a young person today, I would have been like, I don't know that that's even something I want to embark on. So I think it is up to us, but not just us people of color. I think our whole nonprofit community to be, to work, to truly, genuinely work together, not just have trainings, not just talk about it, but actually do the work and walk the walk, like Carl said, and create an environment that allows us to grow, allows people of color to have leadership roles, but also is welcoming and encouraging to the younger generations as well.
Very few additional thoughts. I love what y'all said. The question makes me think about when I was earlier in my career, and I, through the registered dietitian kind of route, I was often evaluated on a number of things. One of them was assertiveness, and that was the only characteristic that I was scored low on. And finally, after my first year at Feeding Texas, I asked my CEO for feedback on just my performance. And she said, she's like, no, you're doing good. And she's like, well, but then I asked him, I said, well, everybody else has always told me that I'm not assertive enough. And I think what freed me was when she said, Rachel, I don't think that's your issue. I think because you look young and you happen, to be Asian American, sometimes people might think that you're not assertive enough. And I just feel like in that moment, intentional or not, I felt really seen, that I didn't need to kind of, like what Christina was saying, like overthink and over assert to have my opinions represented and heard. And it just made for, I think, a more inviting work experience, to know that leadership doesn't have to mean a certain style or a certain characteristic. I come from a culture where leadership looks, the ideal characters of leaders look very different. And so I felt like I could kind of live into that culture and still feel respected as a effective leader. And so I think that's, so the takeaway to me is, like, one, I think learn what different cultural norms are, and then be very intentional about recognizing, points of excellence across all of your emerging leaders, and to allow space for that.
Amen.
Great. Thank you for those answers. So another question we've gotten multiple times in some forms that I'm going to combine is, what's recommended as an effective manner of recruiting Black, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous folks for positions, be it on staff and within board leadership roles?
I'll start. I don't have no formal 3-point plan or whatever, but I think it starts with relationship. right? I think I've recently been a part of a all-white church. I normally have gone to predominantly Black churches where I fellowship and worship at. And the reason that I came to the church is because there was a white brother who basically reached out and connected with me and was intentional about helping me understand the nature of the church, why it was an important place to worship at, why, helped me connect with the pastor. And so just because of his willingness to go out and meet me where I was at in the community, that has been the difference in terms of me kind of becoming a part of the church and having a different worship experience. And so I think for a lot, we can have displays at conferences where we got the people of color table, we trying to record board members, like those are important. I think we can have like formal settings or whatever. But I think until leaders who are in positions are making intentional efforts to engage new people and new blood into these respective positions or roles, you're not going to see a change. You're not going to see a crossover. And I think it starts with having relationship and going out there and taking risks, maybe inviting people to join your board that might not have all the qualifications or have all the connections, but can have the voice and have the perspective. And so we might have to take some opportunities that maybe are not traditional in terms of the resume that people have that traditionally show up on your boards or show up in your organizations, and allow the opportunities for people to come in. Sometimes people are resistant about youth being on your board because they don't have the experience and the knowledge, but I found that when we've allowed youth to come and have perspective, they've brought so many things that we thought were great ideas and great programs and great initiatives that just were flawed because we didn't have no clue how they would actually work and play out in the community. And so I just think we need to be risk takers also in terms of who we invite and who we bring and engage in as a relationship building process.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that when we're thinking about alternatives to building our boards and just building the voices that are advising and creating change for organizations, that sometimes, like, I think of serving on a board may feel, it almost has this kind of superior feel to it, right? Somebody may not feel like they're equipped to serve on a board. They may feel like they don't have something relevant to contribute. I mean, myself included. And I think meeting people where they're at, building up on their strengths, identifying those strengths, and also recognizing that what maybe the traditional perception is of what strengths aren't always the only strengths that we should be considering and valuable to our board diversity, our organizations. And I think that's really important, but I think it takes the collective to look that, to do that as well. I think when I think back to just when I started the organization, I know I mentioned that with those earlier relationships, those all matter to me, getting my foot in the door and building new relationships. I think networking, just even the definition of networking and what that means for communities of color. Like growing up, I had no idea what a network was. I knew what my community was, but I didn't know what a network was. Even something as simple as the terminology that we use is really important and can be a deterrent, or it can be something that is much more inviting. And so I think becoming culturally informed on who we're seeking, what their strengths are, and then in being inclusive in that could be really helpful. And just what we're valuing, right? What we value as a strong credential versus what we don't.
Follow-up question, essentially it's very related, is as we're talking about initiatives related to boards, related to recruitment, et cetera, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, who's choosing folks associated with these groups, right? Are folks being compensated for their work? And kind of speaking to, Carl, what you brought up around measurement, who is designing these metrics and these targets, right? So could you all speak a little bit to that about your observation or your perceptions around how this is occurring as you see it in the nonprofit sector now, and your take on it?
So I'll start. That is a great question. I mean, this is what I do in the margins. This is what I do not as a part of my job, but it's just a part of who I am. So part of the challenge with this is like, I've actually had some ideas about doing initiatives around this for years, around how I could work, particularly with African-American leaders, around making sure that we had more placement and more networking and more connecting in these positions. And I floated the ideas around, and when I pitched it to various institutions or organizations, it never got any traction. And it was hard to get off the ground because I needed resources. I needed actual technology, needed to be able to carve out some of my time to do this on top of my other jobs or whatever. And so I think a lot of times what we find is that a lot of these initiatives die on the vine because there's not the resources or the interest. Now, I think things are changing. We have the new philanthropists. I think there's an intentionality by a lot of funding sources to support intentionality around this work. We could always do more. We could always do better. But I think a lot of times, because we are the voices often raising these things internally in our organizations or on our boards, if the resources aren't there and if there's not a buy-in by it, sometimes they can begin to lag and not have some intentionality to actually getting the light of day. And so I would like to see some more intentionality and investment, like the new philanthropists, around actually investing in initiatives that actually we could measure this and do this. And I think we've been intentional from a measurement standpoint, because I think we're finally understanding that unless we are more intentional at E3 about addressing equity gaps, we are not going to educate all students. It's just not going to happen. And even though the data has been saying that for years, decades, I think now there's been more of a sensitivity around that equity really does matter. It is the currency of the future. It's like we cannot overcome systemic issues around inequity and education if we do not really think about what we're doing with African-American boys. Like with the My Brother's Keeper initiative, I'm so glad that Obama initiated that basically towards the end of his presidency, but it actually gave currency to the fact that why is it that young men of color are traditionally failing, not being educated, and why have we addressed that as a community? Well, people were scared because we didn't want to just work with young men of color. Well, now that we begin to address that, we have an initiative called MBK Scholars, where we are actually addressing that and can have huge systematic impact around a population that will impact the overall education of the entire sector. So I think it's a maturation and a process, but we've got to see the investment, we've got to see the support. I'm sorry, I come off real passionate. I'm a preacher, so, you know. I'm not yelling at you. I love you.
Great. Okay, next question is, do you think funders have any ownership of the leadership of nonprofits? What's their role in the accountability piece of this?
Uh-oh. Anybody? Wait, I just talked. I can talk about this.
I'm scared to talk about this. Okay, repeat the question one more time, and then if I can think about.
Yes, absolutely. Do funders have any ownership, or I use the word accountability, of the leadership of nonprofits?
Can I are you thinking?
You can go, and I'll
Okay,
think of how to phrase it in a way that's
absolutely. And I've been so pleased to see how it has evolved over time since I've been kind of a professional fundraiser for the last 7 years. Funders, he who controls the goal controls the rules, right? So if you have pots of money and funding that nonprofits have to be accountable to and have to get resources to do their mission, ask questions like, what's the diversity on your board? Why hasn't the diversity of your board changed in the last 3-4 years? What is going on with the hiring on your organization? How come it hasn't changed in the last 5 or 6 years? There is interesting things that funders can do that are small, that can have seismic impact on the ability to reach many of these goals. What about the metrics? What about what we measure in grant applications? Are we actually asking equity and inclusionary questions when we ask about how you're delivering your programs and services, and then making them report back on it at the end of the year? So there's things that funders can absolutely do, and they're doing that now. I've talked about the MBK Scholars that the Trellis Foundation, the Michael Susdale Foundation have funded. But when funders begin to champion equity and inclusion and leadership involvement and engagement, then nonprofits will listen and will begin, and board members will begin to take it more seriously, because they know that the lifeblood of their ability to continue out their mission is the ability to get those resources. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. I also think that funders, I think it's important for funders not just to be funders. I think it's important for funders to be partners, and to take the time to really learn about the work that you're doing on the ground level. It's every community that we work with is very rich, very diverse, but it's not a one size fits all. And I think having those transparent, those candid relationships, for us at least, the funders that we have those types of relationships with have been just gold for us. I mean, those are the ones that keep us going. Those are the ones when I feel like I can be my authentic self with a funder, I feel like they are authentic with me as well. I think those are the best working relationships. And I think those are the ones that really help catapult my organization and our work and mission, much more so than the ones who just have these very general guidelines, general expectations across the board of everyone, and not factoring in that every community is very different, has its different values, strengths, cultural beliefs and practices, and how that factors into the work. So I think funders definitely should be challenging us to make sure that we are providing these opportunities for rich, environments with diversity and inclusion, but also funders, I think, should be a part of that process with us, not telling us to do it, but joining us in that process. And then I think that kind of goes, that then could potentially grow out to other funders who maybe aren't ready to do that yet.
And then I would add, I guess, just a few questions for funders too. It's like, one, do people who are trying to access your funds have the same access? If it's mostly about a relationship, then naturally the people that you don't know don't have an equal shot at the same pot of money. Second, I would ask, do your funding formulas take into account the disparities in race? So for example, for food insecurity, we're asking ourselves the same question, like, is our money going to communities that are that experience the greatest barriers for accessing food? And oftentimes that will kind of fall along the lines of race too. And so I think that's really important to look at, is the money going to the most, it's not just about race, is it going to the most strategic places where you can make the greatest impact? And it will likely fall along the lines of race. And then lastly, my third comment is, I think as funders understand that you want to select organizations doing the equity work, is that just a requirement, or are you funding it? I think that's the barrier that we've experienced, is we want to do this work and it's often a requirement for getting the funding, which is great, but could you also help us expand our capacity to consider this work well and weave it into all of our operations? So those are at least our needs and our hopes for funders, and hopefully those are good questions.
Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. That was the last question that we had time for, and just wanted to show our gratitude again. And if you have not checked out the chat, you all really brought up a very delightfully rowdy discussion. So I encourage you all to check that out while I hand it back to Madge.
Thank you. And again, thank you to our panelists, our amazing leaders and Brain Trust for just sharing the morning with us and sharing your experiences. I also want to thank everyone who is on the line with us this morning, and those of you who gave very valuable input into our survey process and the focus groups that we conducted. We look forward to partnering together to transform our understanding of equity at the individual level, interpersonal, institutional, as we really lean into those leadership actions that need to take place at all levels within our organizations as we all overcome racial and systemic barriers. And so in collaboration with the community, we're committed to nurturing diverse leadership so that our sector really has the leadership it desperately needs and deserves. And Mission Capital is looking forward to sojourning with you all. And so we are, in all transparency, as we've shared in past blog posts and through our strategic vision, Mission Capital is changing ourselves. And we're taking a hard, critical, loving look at the work that we do and how we can better serve our nonprofit sector. And so we're adapting our offerings and services, and we want to do this in partnership with you. And so thank you again to Ofronoma Biu of BMP. Thank you to our panelists, Cristina Galazo of Todos Juntos Learning Center, Rachel Coy of Feeding Texas, Carl Nichols of E3 Alliance. Once again, thank you to all of our co-sponsors for the research, co-collaborators, and each of you who chose to be with us today.
Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to us at info@Mission Capital, membership@Mission Capital, or insights@Mission Capital. And we also have an evaluation link in the chat box, but we'll be sending it out via email as well. We're really hopeful to hear from you about the about this survey, about this presentation, and about what your needs are. So please let us know.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.